Well, good evening. As we get started, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and pull those notes right out. I want to read something, and I want you to follow along right on the very top. We're going to talk as we close out our series on how to find God when you're troubled and depressed. Depression is as old as human history. The Bible has many examples of people struggling with despondency and despair. In his depression and fatigue, Elijah asked for his life to be taken. Jonah felt deeply despondent after God did not destroy Nineveh. Jeremiah regretted the day he was born. Job's wife advised him, curse God and die in the midst of his suffering and pain. Well-known church leaders like Martin Luther, John Bunyan, Charles Haddon Spurgeon, and J.B. Phillips struggled with depression on and off throughout their entire life. Political leaders such as Winston Churchill and Abraham Lincoln, as you read their biographies, they struggled significantly with depression. Depression is no respecter of persons. It's been called the common cold of emotional disorders, and it appears in America to be on the rise. 20% of all Americans sometime in their life will be treated for a very significant case of depression, often requiring some level of hospitalization or medication. This is an interesting one when we talk about finding God in difficult times, because this is one that has sometimes some taboo or especially among Christians, like if I really love God, if I'm spiritual, if I'm walking with God, I shouldn't get depressed. And so before we jump in, I have a little bit of extra background in this area. I'm going to walk through with you what depression is, what normal depression is. I'm going to give you some very quick psychological factors, physical factors. I'll define very carefully for you what clinical depression is. You need to know the difference between that and what I call normal depression. And actually, there's even spiritual reasons. So I want you to lean back, and all I want to do is give you a sort of a quick overview of this topic of depression. And then as we get into Psalm 77, all of us have, quote, the common emotional cold. We all feel blue. We all have struggles. We all have ups and downs. But if you don't handle it well, or if you don't know what's going on, or if you think it's abnormal or something's wrong with you, a very normal kind of depression can grow into something much worse. So with that, let's first define what depression is. Depression is a state or feeling of being sad or dejected. It's a mental disorder marked by inactivity. You're not motivated when you're depressed. Feelings of hopelessness, loss of motivation, and a loss of sense of one's own worth. And as you do that, what I want to do is, you'll notice on your notes, it says normal depression. Depression's not always bad. Imagine, if you will, if you've ever sprained your ankle badly and they put one of those air casts on it, and maybe it's some ligaments or they're not sure what's happened, and they blow it up and they put it, and what it does is it immobilizes your leg or your arm. Depression does that for us. There's certain normal things that happen in our lives, like the death of a child or the death of a spouse or a trauma or a tragedy, that literally God has our emotions in such a way that it's like an air cast, and it begins to immobilize us so we can have time to process and work through things. Here's some very common normal times when all of us will tend to get depressed. The death of a spouse, the death of an immediate family member, a divorce or separation in your marriage, the divorce or separation of your parents, moving to a new location, even if it's a good move, an addition to your family, a family member who moves away or moves out from home, sort of that empty nest moment, complete a major goal like graduation. Sometimes you get depressed because you've worked and you finally get there, and then there's this huge letdown. The loss of a job or getting a new job, financial difficulties, the purchase or the sale of a home. I mean, one might be good, the other might be bad, but both can bring depression. Miscarriage or an abortion, the birth of a baby. I think it's about 1 out of 8 or 9 women have severe, it goes into clinical depression of postpartum depression after having a child. Long, extreme work hours, pressures and deadlines that you're racing to meet. Now, everybody's going to experience some of those sometime. And you're normally going to feel blue, and discouraged and sad and have little windows of time that feel like I feel hopeless and the future doesn't look bright. I don't think anything will ever work out. My family's a mess, or I'm a mess, or my finances are a mess, or the future can never be good. This happened to my parents, or I've lost something or someone. Those are times where sort of that air cast of depression is going to come upon your life and mine. And what God wants us to understand is there's ways to respond to that and ways not to respond to that. And some are good and some are very bad. Sometimes depression is not just from events or circumstance, but there's actually physiological or physical factors. Extreme fatigue. If you go and go and go and go, don't get much sleep. Super high stress over a long period of time. Certain kinds of medication. I had a very close friend, a mentor who was just one of the most godly men I ever knew. And he had genetic super high blood pressure and had to take a blood pressure medication that he fought depression all of his life. And I'll share one of the things that he did that helped him work through that. Endocrine imbalance or electrolyte imbalance. I remember being on a team with Glenn Miller, and we were playing in the Philippines. It was super hot. We played multiple games. He got dehydrated, then electrolyte imbalance. Literally came this close to dying. We put him in an ambulance, and they put IVs, but his whole electrolytes went off. And I remember all the way flying back, he was lying on the floor, a special place on the plane. He was having panic attacks. And when he got back for weeks and weeks, he struggled with panic attacks and depression that he never had in his life until the electrolytes in his system. So there's physical things that bring about depression, and they're very hard. Diet, low blood sugar or hypoglycemia, viral infections, hormonal changes, typically at puberty. This is parents, you got to be very aware of what's happening when your son or daughters are going through puberty, and you see some, mood changes, postpartum menopause, underactive thyroid. That's one that often it's amazing. You'll see someone whose thyroid is underactive, it gets addressed, and they'll think like, oh my, you mean everyone looks at life like this? Because they've learned to live with sort of this low-grade sense of life is dark and hard and sad and difficult. Brain injuries, addictions, or the use of mood-altering drugs or alcohol. So those are a lot of physical factors. You can see why it's so widespread in America. Now, here's one thing I want to just, in your notes, it says clinical depression. Clinical depression is when some combination of those things, it might be normal, that might be physical. I'm going to go over some psychological and spiritual issues with depression. Here's what you need to understand. Depression is complex. It's rarely just an event or just emotional or just physical or just spiritual. Usually there's a combination of things. In fact, when you see how God deals with different people in the Bible when they're depressed, there's no one size fits all. When Elijah is depressed, he's come off this mountaintop experience, he's completely depleted, and God says, here's what you need. You're going to just lay low and sleep and get some good food. David gets depressed because he sinned, right? Psalm 32, what he needed was confronted and confession. Jonah, God speaks to him, and he literally rebukes him and, hey, you need to get perspective. So it's a very complex thing when you get depressed. It can't be one size fits all. Well, you did that, and then you always ought to do this. Put a little asterisk in your notes on clinical depression. When you get depressed at a very significant level, and some changes happen in your brain, this is what we call clinical depression, physical factors, the serotonin, the norepinephrine, the chemicals in your brain that causes your synapse to work. If you get so depressed that those things start not working, it's called clinical depression, and you start looking at life like this. No amount of praying, no amount of Bible verses, no amount of counseling, or people saying everything's going to be okay. Literally, your perspective is completely tilted. This is when people that you know and you love, and you can't understand, and someone commits suicide. This can happen to a teenager, a housewife, after a baby. You need to understand is that people look at life like this, and problems that are this big feel this big. And everything is dark. It's so dark, and they can't get out of it themselves. Clinical depression. Now, can God intervene and miraculously do something? Well, he can do that in a broken bone as well. But usually you have to get a broken bone set. And in most clinical depression, you need medical help. often need to get on antidepressants for at least some season, and until your brain is functioning, you can't comprehend what God is saying through his word and prayer and good counseling. Does that make sense? What I don't want you to hear, because we're going to walk through a passage, this is God's plan for the normal, I call it the gray funk. To me, it's like, I used to live over on the coast, and you'd see the fog coming in, and then it would just sort of settle. And sometimes you can almost feel depression coming on. And there's something weird about it. As it comes, I feel kind of down, feel kind of hopeless, feel kind of bummed out. And there's almost part of you like, I think I'll just sit here and get depressed. And then it goes, ugh. And then pretty soon you try and pray, you try to talk, you try to do something positive. You have negative thoughts. You think negatively about other people. There's no motivation. And then you go on this very bad downward spiral. So what you need to understand is clinical depression, when you get where you start having some really, really bad thoughts, this is why we're going to talk about where you go, who you communicate with. But most of us are going to have the common cold kind of depression multiple times in our life. For some of us, a few times each month. Some people struggle with depression a lot more than others. Some of it's literally genetic. There's whole lines of people that are going to have difficulty with depression. And as Christians, what we need to understand is that's no different than having genetic or some issue in some other area. It doesn't mean you're a bad person or you're unspiritual to be depressed. Let me give you some psychological factors and then some spiritual factors. And then what I want to do is really turn the page and say, okay, for all of us, mostly normal depression issues, what's God's solution? Because what you're going to see is the Bible's so relevant. God has hope for us when we feel dark and discouraged. So physical factors we talked about. Now psychological factors, a major loss in your life, both either real or perceived. Anger that is turned inward. You might just jot a note. 95% of psychological depression is anger turned inward. You're mad, you're frustrated, and you stuff it. Guilt, real or imagined. A major transition from, like adolescence or midlife, emptiness, retirement, just any kind of major loss, grief. It could be the loss of a dream, loss of a job. In any major loss, when you start having grief psychologically, can cause you to get depressed. Faulty or negative thinking. Some of us have been trained by family of origin to think negatively about everything. I mean, the cup isn't even half full for some of you. Being around negative people. That's a good one, isn't it? I mean, we're all around some negative people sometimes, but if that's all that you're around all the time, it can be very discouraging, very depressing. A low self-esteem, unrealistic expectations, or just self-pity. Those are all very common psychological factors. Spiritually, there's other factors. Spiritual exhaustion after successful ministry. Sometimes you bust it and bust it and bust it and bust it, and God did great things, and for reasons you can't understand, you are so bummed out afterwards. A spiritual attack. This is a part of my history. It took me quite a while to figure it out. It doesn't happen near as much anymore, but I would have for years, about Saturday, I've always taught a Saturday night service, about 1 o'clock, I was just kind of fine-tuning, getting ready to go to church, and I'd be walking in the light, and it's literally like a sheet would come down on Saturday at 1 o'clock. And it wasn't like I was discouraged. It was like life. I'm the worst pastor in the world. I'm the worst man in the world. I'm the worst father in the world. I have nothing to say. Everything that I study is meaningless. And I would have this window of time that I'd just be like, oh my lands. And I didn't realize it was spiritual opposition. And so my response when I started to do spiritual warfare, I watched God break that. So discerning, is it physical or is it spiritual? Is it you just been going too hard? Could it be spiritual attack? A wrong perspective or self-effort. And what I mean by that is trying to do God's will in the energy of the flesh. Trying so hard to do what God wants you to do, but not trusting God, not being empowered by the Spirit. A spiritual disappointment. I mean, there's times where we really think, God, this is what you want, this is what you want. And you go, that? Like Jeremiah, and he's just super discouraged. Spiritual confusion. I mean, there's times where you're praying and seeking, and it's like, God, what is going on? And can get really discouraged and depressed. A rebellion like Saul. Saul had major mental problems because he rebelled against God. Remember, he would have David come and play music, and it would help kind of ease the depression. Well, he was in a state of rebellion. God said, do this. He said, I'm doing that. When you're going the opposite direction that you know is God's will, don't be surprised if you don't get depressed. Unresolved resentment and bitterness, and probably the biggest one is lack of forgiveness. There is just something amazing that happens when we do not forgive people and what that does to our soul and our psyche. Well, at the very bottom, here's the question: what do you do when you get depressed? I mean, just the normal, run-of-the-mill, feeling blue, feeling down, not very motivated, kind of sinking. I feel I'm depressed. It's not clinical. I'm not suicidal, but I'm bummed out. I'm not motivated, feel kind of hopeless, not very excited about my marriage, not excited about being single, don't really like my job. You know, it's closing in, closing in, closing in. What do? Do you fake it? Do you deny it? Do you bury it? Do you kind of just break down? You know? Do you blow up? Some people get really angry. Do you eat? Go shopping? Watch TV? Buy a toy? Push harder? I'm just going to power through this. Have an affair? Get a workout? Call your therapist? What do? Those are all very common options when people get depressed. Well, as you open your notes, and from the sound, it sounds like you're there and I'm not, there's an answer here, and the answer is Psalm 77. And just a little bit of context, this is a very godly man writing this. He wrote only a few Psalms. It's during the time of David when David is king, and worship was awesome. I mean, awesome. David was a musician, and worship was great in Israel. This was the worship leader. Now, he didn't have an Australian accent, but he was the worship leader. And like all people in life and all people in ministry, you know, something happened. We don't get the background, but something happened in his life where he's discouraged, and his discouraged goes beyond depression. And what I've done is I've taken it and I've studied the psalm, and then I've laid it out, and I believe there's very clearly about 6 life lessons from Psalm 77. First of all, let's look at this song of comfort. This is the dark night of the soul. You are bummed out. What do? What does he do? Verse 1, I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord at night. I stretched out untiring hands, and my soul refused to be comforted. I remembered you, O God, and I groaned, and I mused, and my spirit grew faint. Lesson number 1, when you get discouraged and depressed, cry out to God. That's the first thing. It's so easy to do something else, like watch TV, or go eat, or go shopping. See, when depressive feelings come, we have responses, and we get into patterns. Negative responses cause a downward spiral. Positive responses help us begin to deal with it in a good way. Just notice what he said. Notice verse 1. I cried out, I sought the Lord, I stretched out untiring hands. He's a worship leader. Life is dark. He's super bummed out, but where's he going? By the way, he doesn't feel like it. Okay, he doesn't feel like it. But he goes to God. And literally, he cries out. This isn't like, God, I'm really having a bad day, and I would really like your help. This word is, he's crying out loud. He's saying, God, help me. I'm struggling. By the way, jot down, if you would, very interesting passage, Hebrews 5:7. Speaks of Jesus. It's one of those times where we get a window into Jesus' lives. It says, in the days, plural, of Jesus on earth, he cried out to God. Cried out with loud crying and tears. So in the days, in other words, not on a day. Jesus was fully God, but he was fully human. And in his humanness, he had disappointment and grief and betrayal and struggle and fatigue and stress. And when he felt overwhelmed, and he had the dark night of the soul, he was tempted in every way like us, and depression was one of those. And he would go to a lonely place by himself, and he would verbally, out loud, cry out to the Lord, and he would share his emotions, and it says in loud cries and tears. Something happens when you get it out and you bring it to God. When you start feeling low, that's the first and maybe the most important step. He's in distress. He's not comforted. Notice the symptoms. He's sleepless, confused, despair, discouraged, and depressed. The second stanza, he goes on, you kept my eyes from closing. In fact, he's blaming God at this point. Anybody else do that? You kept I can't sleep. I was too troubled to speak. Well, why? Well, could have been circumstances, could have been this, could have been that, but he's too troubled. Trouble, and it's God's fault. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. He's looking backwards and going, wow, it used to be great. And man, it's not great now. My heart mused and my spirit inquired. You know what he does? There's a little shift here. Recall past blessings in verses 4 through 6. First, he blames God. He goes, I can't sleep. You know, he's thinking of one of those psalms that God gives to his beloved sleep. God cares for us. He gives us rest. What about all those promises of peace? He goes, I can't sleep. He says, I remember great times with you. I remember intimate times with you. I remember when I would wake up in the middle of the night and I would have this intimate, close time with you. And he's a worship leader, so he probably sang. And he's thinking, that was then, and this is now. And then he says, what's he say? He says, my heart mused, I thought, and I inquired. And so he's beginning a little process to deal with his depression. He ponders the struggle. And then as he ponders, he does something that most of us don't feel the freedom to do. He asks God the hard questions. See, sometimes when life's not going well and people let you down and you feel betrayed, and as far as you know, you did exactly what God wanted you to do and the sale fell through. You did exactly what you were supposed to do and that person walked out on you. You did exactly what you were supposed to do and you were honest and you didn't. There's times where, you know, this is totally unfair. Where are you, God? Where are your promises? Where's your provision? Where's your protection? Because I've got all that in my head, and I've experienced it some over here, but my life right now, it's not working at all. And so notice, he asks God hard questions. There's 6 rhetorical questions beginning at verse 7. Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? 2, his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he, in anger, withheld his compassion? Now, just by way of knowing where this guy's at emotionally, why don't you get a pen out and underline the word reject, and then underline the word show his favor, and then put a box around never. And then unfailing vanished love. Has it vanished? Promise failed. God forgotten. In anger withheld. I mean, this is a guy who has absolute despair and doubt. Rejected, vanished, promise failed, love. And then notice, how long does he think this is going to go on? When you're depressed, you lose perspective. So how long does he think this is going to happen as he's asking these questions? Notice in verse 7, reject forever. Put a box around forever. Put a box around never. Could he ever show his favor again? And the question mark here is probably not. Or has unfailing love vanished? Box around forever. Is his promise going to fail how long? All time. You get the idea?